Oh, negative, man.
So we have 1 minute to start time, and if you didn't get a chance to grab a question blank form, go ahead and do that. And also, if you need a hard space to write, in the back is a counter that can help you do that as well. Thank you for being here. 30 seconds, more people coming in the door, and we'll get started.
Thank you.
And I do want you to know that I'm recording this for legal reasons, but nobody in the audience will be filmed. They'll only pointing toward me, so you don't have to worry about that. Your privacy will be protected, but for my legal reasons, I do record every presentation I make. So we're going to begin with some good news. And can you hear me okay all the way in the back? Nice. Good, thank you. Hope is a tricky thing, but we're going to begin with some hope, and that is the District Attorney's Office, the new administration, has a new mindset. And I'm just going to start with a quote from Matt Malaro. He says, "I agree that the public's trust in law enforcement, and perhaps more importantly, its trust in the criminal justice system is critical. For the public to trust a system, it must first understand that system, its underpinnings, and its current practices. The ability to assess the credibility of those trusted to serve and protect the community is critical to the continued functioning of the criminal justice system." And that is a brand new attitude in our District Attorney's Office in the 8th Judicial District. So we have hope. There's going to be a lot of stressful things that you'll learn today, but as we focus on those problems, we think about the solutions, and we have a great new administration in the DA's office. So lawsuits, even those with millions in payouts, do not stop corruption. What actually those lawsuits do is make the corruption go deeper, so that it makes it harder for the public to find out what's happening. Corruption stops when the community understands how it's happening. And that's a large part of what I've been doing for the past 15 years, is trying to figure out, how exactly is this happening? How do these people keep getting away with crimes? Honest law enforcement officers are being damaged by the corruption and are suffering as deeply as the community members. It's just harder to see their pain. So this is not in any way to be seen as an attack on law enforcement officers. I have friends and family who are in law enforcement at all levels, local, state, and federal. So this is not an attack on them. This is showing where the problems are. We're going to move through the evidence section pretty briskly. So if you have questions, please keep track of those as we go along, and then we'll have at the very end a dedicated questions section. And a trigger warning, just out of respect, if you are a victim of injustice, I will be using audio and video from actual cases, and sometimes that can make you uncomfortable if you have experience with problems in the system, so be aware of that. And actually, I saw a therapy dog walk in, which I was grateful for. If anybody needs a little break, there is a therapy dog somewhere in the back on the right over there. So it was a wonderful addition. So the case just shown today presents a fraction, a small portion of the hundreds of cases that I've researched over the past 15 years. And the cases that I chose to show today are actually the best examples of how corruption happens and how you can learn to stop it.
Okay. And could you tell me what
occurred at Mason Street Flats in downtown Fort Collins at an under-construction apartment building owned by Brinkman Construction. The man who made that 911 call was the only witness who saw the particular individual running from the scene, and that eyewitness was never interviewed by police. This evidence marker shows a Rolex watch. It was a $4,000 Rolex watch that was owned by Benjamin Gilmore. He was a local business owner. His name was engraved on the back, and that was found at the fire scene. The defense's expert in this trial was Dr. Bastian Cornelissen. He was blocked from testifying about much of what could have shown that Benjamin Gilmore was innocent. Dr. Cornelissen is a certified fire and explosion investigator and a metallurgical engineer, so he knows a little bit about fire scenes and also damage that occurs from fires of this size. So as we watch the video clips today from these cases, if it's an extra long video clip, I'll let you know that, but usually they're around 2 to 3 minutes, so you're going to know what to expect on the length of these videos.
You testified that fire-erosion damage has been thoroughly discredited as evidence of arson. What changed that widely held belief?
What changed that was scientific experiments, where compartments were packed with flammable materials, couches, boxes, and the like, and it was shown that extreme fire spread could occur even in the absence of ignitable liquids. In other words, as long as you have enough fuel in the building, the fire doesn't particularly care what form that fuel takes. The spread can be rapid, the transition to flashover or full room involvement can be very rapid. So the fact that the fire spread quickly or burned at a very high intensity, those are no longer considered acceptable indicators of arson.
So the Mason Flats Clean Flats fire the fire did burn quickly, is that correct?
Yes.
And it spread rapidly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was arson.
No, it simply means that the fire gained access to a great deal of fuel. One of the construction people had testified that buckets of roofing compound were kept at this location. And obviously one of the things you might have to consider is, could there have been a small fire burning, perhaps a warming fire from a transient or a cooking fire that was abandoned and eventually impinged on a 5-gallon bucket of a highly flammable material. You would get exceptionally rapid fire spread, but it still would classify as arson. It would be considered an accidental fire.
Were you aware that there were homeless transient people staying in that building?
Yes.
You tested.
So Paul and Kevin Brinkman are the building owners. They gave conflicting testimony about the financial health of their construction business just prior to the fire, and insurance photos were ironically taken just 3 days prior to this fire. The prime suspect was Jerry Salazar. People called him Clutter. He was known as a traveler or a hobo. He would ride trains since he was 16 years old. He just hopped trains and rode across the United States. And he told many people on the morning of that fire that he accidentally started the fire.
Did Clutter tell you directly that he started the Mason Street Flats fire?
Yes, he did.
What did he say about it?
He said that he had gone up there and he was getting drunk and stuff, and apparently he said something to do with after he loaded his rig and stuff, and couldn't just spit it on what we call the sturdy thing, and shot up, and then apparently either he had fallen over or kicked it over, and it was like sort of like an accident sort of thing, basically, but like he ended up like waking up and stuff, and then Jimmy jamming on back on down there because he couldn't put it out,
So this is the interrogation room at Fort Collins Police Services with an ATF agent in the back corner and detectives Mike Averick and Brian Vogel. And if you watch, I play the video, watch the detective's right hand as he takes evidence from the suspect without wearing gloves. And the evidence that he takes from the prime suspect is never entered into the evidence log, and it disappears basically. That evidence is actually the key information relevant to the accidental starting of this fire. And he was the prime suspect at this time. The detectives knew that, and the fact that they're not wearing gloves as they're handling this evidence is problem number one. He's reaching deep into the pockets, and again, the detective doesn't know what's in the pockets. He could get cut, he could get poked with a needle. There are many things that go wrong this first 3 minutes. So the prime suspect is a flight risk. He was on probation and parole for assaulting a police officer in Boulder, but the Fort Collins Police Services decided he could leave the state, even though he was under investigation for what they called a $10 million arson fire. Mr. Salazar was found dead in Oregon prior to the first trial. The Lane County Sheriff's Office explained to me that I was the only person from Larimer County who ever contacted them about Mr. Salazar's death. No investigators, no ATF, nobody contacted these law enforcement officers. And Mr. Salazar's death was suspicious. It had been closed because they hadn't had any further leads, but once I met with them in Oregon, they reopened the case to investigate what actually happened to Mr. Salazar. The ATF issued their findings about the origin and cause of the fire based on, quote, the elimination of potential accidental sources, consideration of evidence located at the scene, as well as witness statements, end quote. The ATF ruled the fire an arson, even though NFPA 921 specifically states that using elimination of potential sources, evidence that has not been tested, and witness statements is no longer a valid fire investigation method because it is not consistent with the scientific method. The ATF made their findings of arson less than 9 days after the fire and without performing any laboratory testing. To put the unusual short time frame of the Mason Street Flats fire investigation into perspective, consider this. A recent fire in a small, locally owned restaurant involved the ATF, arson was suspected, the owners were suspects, evidence was sent to the lab, and it took a full year to determine the cause of that fire was accidental. The ATF in 9 days decided that a $10 million fire was due to arson. But if any of you are familiar with Burns Restaurants in North Fort Collins all the way up the canyon, that fire started on the roof. It was just a little installation of a new heating system, and it took the ATF and the local fire investigators a year to determine that was arson. This massive fire in downtown Fort Collins was determined in 9 days. The City of Fort Collins and the Downtown Development Authority were the lost payees on that insurance policy. So it turned out the conflict of interest was severe, and the beneficiaries were actually investigating their own crime. This is a video. There's no audio, but Detective Wes Haynes from the Fort Collins Police was actually not realizing he was being caught on audio. He was in the Boulder Police Department to interview another suspect, and was talking about, Detective Haynes was talking about how he understood that the homeless people in the building had accidentally knocked over a sterno can, and that it was an accidental fire. Now, this was the day after Benjamin Gilmore was arrested for arson.
There was an apartment complex in Newport City trying to walk away from the gas cans. Well, this one, they were going to be pretty famous out of Seattle. They were prison. Really was nervous. People had, we got video all the way around. And one of them was, it was actually fired going, and it just went up so big. But so we all their transports and we're all the city buses are walking. And it's there, and it goes here, and it comes back in 20 seconds. First thing, you see the building, just come there and see it, it's totally dark. And it's already blown out in a second. So what they theorize is that they double fire and that's the building, and flashed over and blew out.
So he says they started a little warming fire and it got spilled. In science investigations for fires, there's a difference between a fire that gets spilled and a fire that is intentionally started. So this detective is admitting he didn't realize he was being filmed or audio recorded, but he admitted to the Boulder officer they knew it was an accident. So Judge Devin Odell handled the both trials for Mr. Gilmore. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, so he was tried a second time. And this is what Judge Odell said in sentencing. I'm humble enough to say that I can't be absolutely sure of the truth. And I'm also honest enough to know that yes, sometimes juries make mistakes, and sometimes courts make mistakes. But I'm humble enough to know that I'm not perfect, and the system's not perfect. Judge Odell was admitting that he knew there was a lot of problems with this case, and basically that he understood that Benjamin Gilmore was innocent, and he had to sentence him anyway. The district attorney was asking for 30 years, and Judge Odell gave Mr. Gilmore 8 years. This has been Gilmore. This is shortly before he was charged and convicted with arson. But what did Sheriff Smith say? So Sheriff Smith posted on his Facebook page that was picked up by the Fort Collins, Colorado one, quote, "They refuse to recognize the American judicial process," Smith said in a Facebook post on Thursday morning. "In that process, defendants have the rights to appeal through the courts. They don't go to an executive officer to summarily overturn the jury." What he's talking about there is that when I realized that I had a lot of evidence from the district attorney's discovery file that there actually was no crime here, and that the district attorneys, the Fort Collins detectives knew that they were sending an innocent man to prison, I took the information, the evidence, to Sheriff Smith to show him we have a problem here, there are crimes being committed, but it's not Mr. Gilmore who's doing it. So Sheriff Smith turned that around and said that I simply just don't understand the judicial process. When in fact I understand it clearly, and that's why I was contacting who was supposed to be the most powerful law enforcement officer in a county to have him start an investigation. He refused. So at sentencing, the day before sentencing, Fort Collins Police Services Detective Mike Averick sent out an inflammatory email saying that there was a lot of propaganda going around the community, and he wanted the fire and police personnel to fill the courtroom so that Mr. Gilmore's supporters could not find seats. Mr. Gilmore was ordered to pay $7.5 million in restitution for a fire that was accidentally started, not by Mr. Gilmore, but by a homeless man cooking drugs on a sterno can. Next part. So why the focus on Brian Koopman? I've been focused on Brian Koopman since 2015 when a elected official sent an email saying, hey, I wonder what's up with this dude. We keep paying a lot of money to defend him. So I started investigating Brian Koopman in early 2015, and the reason for that is because Brian Koopman is a really easy test subject. He provides a lot of information. He shows a lot of the methods and tactics being used by corruption, specifically in law enforcement. He's cost the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees and settlements. And he's been shielded for the past 2 decades from responsibility. That's interesting to me, and that is my sole reason for pursuing this, to understand how it happens and why, and also how to stop it. This is his most, I would say, famous case. It was sugar stupid. This is a historic Loveland sugar factory. This is a copy of the affidavit for a no-knock search warrant that Brian Koopman filled with lies. Koopman repeatedly uses affidavits for search and arrest to start the cases on the wrong foot for the innocent. So what he does is he makes up a lot of lies that are very convincing. Judges believe law enforcement officers just automatically. And that's one of the ways that corrupt law enforcement officers get away with so much, because the judges are trusting that the police are telling them the truth in their affidavits. This is the attic where Brian Koopman said a large-scale meth lab was being operated. And again, this is in the historic Loveland sugar factory. I was in this attic and saw that there had been no disruption to this attic for decades. There were still records from decades ago from the sugar factory. There was actually a raccoon looking at me at this particular point. It was obvious there had never been any disruption to that original attic. So this is a video, 2 parts. The first part is the no-knock SWAT raid. Brian Koopman raided the wrong building. The white building in the front is not even part of the sugar factory. And then the second part, you'll hear Detective Koopman testify under oath in a civil lawsuit that resulted from this raid. This is Detective Brian Koopman's no-knock raid at the historic Loveland sugar factory. Detective Koopman accused Jeremy Myers of operating a meth lab in the attic of the red building in the background. Detective Koopman raided the white building, which is not part of the Myers property. The white building belongs to Amalgamated Sugar. Detective Koopman seized items from the white building that operated as a sugar beet lab. The items seized from the white building were not the property of the Myers. The items seized in this no-knock raid included sugar, dairy creamer, insect parts, and building materials.
Do you know where this jar of what ultimately turned out to be sugar was located during your search?
In what we refer to as the white building.
The white building is the building that is to the northwest of the red brick building.
Yes.
The white building you have discovered that does not belong to Jeremy Myers or James Myers.
In hindsight, yes.
You currently are right in the first floor of this building right here. This is the office building. This is the white building. These are property lines. Now, if you went to the county, could you tell whether the light building was on this piece of property or this piece of property?
When you write out a search warrant for premises, do you check anything to determine who owns the premises?
Yes.
Did you do that in this case?
I did.
In fact, it has a different address.
I now know that, but I didn't know that at the time.
But this is the building where they found the jar of sugar.
Yes.
And this is your...
This is where we're in this building right now. We're standing on the first floor on this end of this building right here.
And that is your property, obviously. The boundaries, the property lines are there.
But you did no formal checking of any county records or anything of that nature.
I did look at it, but they are extremely confusing on where the dividing lines could or couldn't be.
This is the white building. These are property lines.
So this is Koopman's evidence of a large-scale meth lab. Now, when this bust went down, the newspapers were all over it. From the very beginning, this particular family was destroyed by Brian Koopman's false reporting, his false affidavits. And if you look at the photo on the right, that's actually the jar of sugar that has been well preserved, and that's the original condition. The top of the lid is very rusty. It's apparently not been moved for decades. And when you look at it, you can see it's a jar of sugar. And they found it in the sugar factory. This is more of Koopman's evidence of a meth lab. And by the way, the historic Loveland sugar factory is across the street from the Loveland Police Department. An interesting fact also, the Myers who owned this property had to repeatedly call law enforcement for help to come to their property because there were trespassers there constantly. It's a historic building, people were curious about it. So they were constantly calling law enforcement to come to the property. If there was a meth lab on that property, do you think the owners would continually have law enforcement there? And Brian Koopman knew that was happening. He knew they were being brought to their property all the time. It was across the street from the police department. So this is another example of what Brian Koopman swore under oath was evidence of a meth lab. This is, on his evidence sheet, it actually says a clear jar with white residue. They found this in the kitchen area of the white building, which was the sugar beet lab, so it's in the kitchen, and it was coffee creamer, also in a very old jar. This became, so when the test came back that the sugar was actually sugar and not meth, Brian Koopman added charges onto the innocent business owner. He said that instead of meth, he was probably making bombs. And this particular cup was part of Koopman's evidence of bombs. And inside this old stained coffee cup was bug parts. And that's actually in the affidavit, or in the findings. Another part of his evidence is a white glass mug with black liquid. It was found in the kitchen of the sugar beet lab. What do you usually find in a kitchen in a white mug with black stain in it? Obviously coffee. So this headline, again, the Reporter Herald blew this, every time something happened in this case, Brian Koopman made sure that they blew it up. This damaged the credibility of the family and the family's business beyond repair. So here's the headline: CBS test on the meth shocks the courtroom. The reason it shocked the courtroom was because it was sugar found at a sugar factory. So this is Lieutenant Brent Newbanks. He was Koopman's supervisor for a very long time. He's now the chief of police at the Meade Police Department. Here they are at a forum in 2015 with Sheriff Justin Smith. And this educational forum was focused on teaching the public about the importance of the Fourth Amendment, how to protect yourself, and how to make sure that you don't violate rights. And then we'll see Detective Koopman testifying again about the sugar factory lawsuit. And I forgot to mention this, but I just want to let you know that this is not a good idea to live stream this or to broadcast this. I forgot to tell you that at the beginning. So if you are live streaming or broadcasting this in any way, please respect the sensitivity of this evidence and refrain from doing that.
Yeah, Lieutenant Brent Newbanks with the Loveland Police Department. Obviously, you can tell that an officer must know when they can make a search or a seizure and when they cannot do that and what it requires. That's good. But Cliff would agree that that's maybe not the most important part, because if they can't write it into a report and put those details down on paper, then we commonly say that it didn't happen. Because if it's not in the report, which is going to get reviewed, which is going to be used to make the decision of whether they were acting correctly or not, then they won't be successful. So that's another critical part of it.
Who did you report to, if anyone, during your pre-video camera surveillance?
My sergeant.
And your sergeant was?
Sergeant Brent Eubanks.
What discussions did you have with Sergeant Eubanks?
I explained to him that I received a tip about a possible meth lab at the old sugar factory in Loveland that I was investigating it.
And is Sergeant Eubanks a Loveland police officer?
Yes.
What was the response from Sergeant Eubanks when you told him you were investigating the sugar factory property?
I would be assuming, but I was just briefing him or letting him know this is what I'm doing. I don't recall exactly what his response is other than, okay, let me know what you need.
Did you keep any kind of a log as to when you saw a vehicle?
Yes.
And where is that?
Destroyed.
You destroyed the log that you kept?
Field notes.
Correct. Did you destroy them?
Yes.
When did you do that?
At the filing of the case.
Why would you do that?
Because if they can't write it into a report and put those details down on paper, then we commonly say that it didn't happen.
You don't have any of the field notes with which you author the police reports, correct? So therefore, you'd want to keep a record of it, would you not?
I suppose you could.
Because they can't write it into a report and put those details down on paper, and then we commonly say that it didn't happen. Do we have a lieutenant?
So this is one way corruption hides in plain sight. You write a report, then you hide it. Or you write a report, then you destroy it. Or you write a report and you hide it. And then you fill it with lies, and then you release it a decade later when it's too late for any statute of limitations. And when Sheriff Smith and Lieutenant Newbanks gave this public educational forum in 2015, it kept sticking with me. I couldn't sort it out because there were so many Fourth Amendment violations that the Loveland Police Department and the Delaware County Sheriff's Office were involved in at that time. I could not understand why they were so blatantly showing how they had violated a lot of people's rights. And it was Lieutenant Newbanks who I could never get out of my mind for the past 7 years, when he kept talking about how they can't write it into a report, they can't write it into a report. And that was the clue for me. I knew there was something there, and I'll explain why that was such a big deal. So this is a lawsuit against Brian Koopman that was filed by the innocent business owner in the It Was Sugar student case. And it took 10 years for that business owner and his family to fight through federal courts, up and down the court system, but he finally won. After the settlement was reached, the innocent business owner had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which, by the way, in public, having to do with public money is completely illegal, but the city of Loveland uses this practice all the time. A non-disclosure agreement when using public funds is illegal, but here's how they get around it. They have the innocent person sign the NDA. That means they can't talk about it. But guess who can keep talking? Brian Koopman. The guilty party can keep talking and lying about the family forever. And there's nothing the innocent people can do about it. So like I was saying, this is Chief of Police Brent Newbanks, who's in the Meade Police Department now in Weld County. This is one way that corruption breeds and travels through an entire state. Brent Newbanks knew about Brian Koopman's trouble for years, for many years, and he did nothing to stop it. And actually, he encouraged it. And now he's the Chief of Police in Meade. And this is a 6-minute clip. It is worth every moment. And if you think you know everything there is to know about former Berthoud police officer Jeremy Yachik, I had my eyes open. So please, please, with all of the people that you see today, give them a wide open mind and heart.
There's a couple I can think of, even in Loveland PD, that if their name came across my desk for any reason, I would believe 100% what they're saying, because I know them to be people of high integrity. The problem is that they hire people that have wishy-washy integrity. And then you get dudes like, Brian Koopman, that have no integrity, that are pretty good at pretending to have integrity. But then when they do things that lack integrity, because they're so good at pretending, they've got people whitewashed so well, they get away with it. And I can only think that, like, he got away with it for so long because of complicity from the higher-ups. I mean, it started out with Hecker. Guarantee you he knew what was going on. But it was okay with it. It was that culture in that detective bureau that it was like, all right, well, I don't really care. These guys are making arrests, they're doing what they need to do. Yeah, I don't know what Hecker's deal was, I don't know what Tyser's deal is, but I would figure that Tyser would come through there and kind of clean house. Because, there's good people there, but they're stifled by the bad people. And you get that good old boys club going where, a few handful of their little clique, if you're not part of that, then that's happened. I know a lot of officers at LPD that's happened to, where they've, gone against the little clique in that detective bureau, and then it was like, all of a sudden they're getting, in trouble or fired it goes department to department, and the severity of it varies, but I mean, it can be anything from, passive aggressive comments to full on, like, trying to get somebody fired, or coming up with, setting people up to get them fired, stuff like that. And,
What caused the Berthoud Police Department to be taken over by the Loveland County Sheriff's Office? What was that all about?
That's a loaded question. Well, so the official story was because the whole thing that went down with my stuff, and then they had the quote-unquote independent third party come do a review of the department, but that independent third party that they had review the department was the Sheriff's Department. And the Sheriff's Department had been trying for many years to take over Berthoud PD. Like, they had been after that for years. And part of it was a targeted opportunity with all the things, with the whole, show that went down with what I had going on. They took that as, okay, this is our opportunity to come in, and we'll do this third-party evaluation. And I mean, I read that evaluation, and 90% of what they said in there was not true at all. And I think that they did Chief Johnson dirty with that evaluation. We had a very good department, and the town was very well protected and served with that police department.
Why did the Sheriff's Office want control?
It's funny because people had to arrest people, and people that didn't want to take responsibility for their actions, like, oh, it's all about money, and I never believed them. But after everything I've been through, I can tell you unequivocally, it's all about money. And that's all it's about, because it was I think, $4 million line item in the budget, which meant that they could hire more people, they could get more stuff, which really means that they have more people patrolling the county, because my understanding of their service to the Berthoud community, and I may be wrong, forgive me if I am, isn't super great, and they aren't always there because they go on District 4 call. So they cover a lot more area, and so therefore there's not near the amount of people to be there to give it that kind of, personal attention. And they've done the same thing with voluntary. And Berthoud had always been like the red-headed stepchild in the eyes of the Sheriff's Office. Like, I remember when I first moved up here, I asked a buddy of mine that worked at the Sheriff's Office that was one of our students at the academy, and he was like, well, you can get hired at Berthoud, but they aren't very great, And I think that was more of a comment of the old chief. But, Chief Johnson, I think, did a really good job with that department. And I think it was just another line item in the budget, which more money means more money. And more money means more money for everybody, pay, whatever. I don't think that there's any, like, embezzling or anything like that going on. I mean, you never know, but I would hope not. I would hope that Justin Smith has enough integrity to not let that happen. But I know some things that they've done in the past that will show a severe lack of integrity. And even my dealings with John Fain, when he took over the police department down there as the acting chief while they were figuring everything out, I could just tell, like I didn't trust that guy here anytime I talked to him. And it's really, it sucks because they had a really good little department going.
It's another way that corruption spreads. You take the most corrupt people in a jurisdiction and take over small law enforcement agencies that are successful, that are working. So Brian Koopman, this is Judge Julie Kunstfield. Brian Koopman was the lead detective on a Loveland homicide, and Brian Koopman lied so many times in the initial stages of this homicide case that the public defenders who were representing the defendant filed a motion to compel the prosecution of Detective Koopman. They filed that motion with the judge of the case, which was Julie Kunstfield. This is an example of the public defender's motion. Quote, "The discovery provided by the district attorney's office and the testimony given by Detective Koopman at the preliminary hearing in this case established that Detective Koopman committed the crime of perjury in the first degree, a class 4 felony." So when a public defender files a motion like this, it's pretty serious. It's because they have a lot of evidence showing that it's justified. Detective Koopman failed to enter the video into evidence. The video was not disclosed to the defense. Equivocal inconsistencies between Koopman's testimony and what the video actually depicts. So just prior to trial, the public defenders realized that their client was being lied about time after time after time, and there was no way they could effectively represent their client with Brian Koopman on the case. More from their motion, these materially false statements were made knowingly. Koopman was not confused by the questions. He wasn't tricked. And what Koopman testified is actually diametrically opposed to what the video shows. So when that motion didn't work, they filed another motion. They asked the court to find that Detective Brian Koopman was incredible as a matter of law. And that's a legal phrase saying that when you say somebody's incredible as a matter of law, it means you can't trust them. It means nothing they say or do is reliable. And again, Julie Finsfield denied it. Detective Koopman already gave testimony that conflicted considerably with the testimony of his fellow detective, Chris Kamofsky. This is another thing that Brian Koopman does repeatedly. When he gets caught lying, he usually ends up blaming another law enforcement officer. And because of the relationships among law enforcement officers, once you're lied about, you have to keep the lie going. Chris Kamofsky, even if he wanted to, was not in a position to say, Detective Koopman is lying about me. He had to keep the lie going. Another thing that Koopman does a lot is that he'll forget to push the record button on an interrogation, or he'll forget to log the video into evidence. He has a lot of tricks that he uses in all of these cases. And by the way, Brian Koopman is the lead officer in nearly 900 cases in Larimer County. 900 cases. That doesn't count all of the federal cases he's been involved in or with other states that he assists on cases. So this is Brian Koopman's felony charge. He was charged with a felony for lying in the homicide case we just talked about. And that Brian Koopman's record has been sealed. There is no evidence of it besides this little screenshot, thankfully I have. You will not find any evidence that Brian Koopman was ever charged with a crime. That's one of the perks. So Tammy Fisher was in good standing law enforcement officer with Loveland Police Department, and Brian Koopman accused her of egregious acts, none of which Tammy Fisher did. Brian Koopman specifically accused Tammy Fisher of tipping off a suspect in an investigation. Tammy Fisher knew nothing about that investigation, and there was no way she could have tipped off the suspect. But Brian Koopman repeatedly accuses others of tip-offs when he gets caught with a bad case. This is directly from the Fisher v. Koopman. Quote, "The city of Loveland was well aware at the time of this incident of Koopman's propensity to fabricate and falsify documents, to seek criminal charges without probable cause, and otherwise conduct his investigations to achieve the results he desired. And the city of Loveland knew or should have known of Koopman's reputation within the department as having ultimate supervisory control of the police department." Tammy Fisher's husband, Jeff Fisher, was also a Loveland police officer in good standing, and Mr. Fisher was passed over for a promotion because of Brian Koopman's lies about his wife, Tammy. And Jeff Fisher, instead of suing the city of Loveland, settled. Jeff Fisher was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement for that settlement, but the NDA, that non-disclosure agreement, allows Brian Koopman to continue lying about both Jeff and Tammy Fisher. Remember, the city of Loveland used non-disclosure agreements constantly to cover up illegal actions by the police department. They're designed to allow the guilty people to continue the story, and the innocent people are not allowed to rebut that. It's another form of force. Here's the case in point. John Fain's running for sheriff. Brian Koopman is still lying about Jeff and Tammy Fisher. And this time Koopman does it while he's propping up his his integrity-filled campaign friend, John Fayette. So, because the Fishers can't talk publicly because of the NDA, Brian Koopman has unrestrained abilities to continue discrediting Jeff and Tammy Fisher. And you probably all are familiar with the fact that once somebody starts a lie about you, it's very difficult to reverse that. So this is a 2013 case that Koopman was the lead detective on. It was dismissed in 2021. It took 8 years for this innocent man to fight Detective Koopman's lies, but he finally did it. In this motion to dismiss the case, the district attorney says, quote, "The people are no longer able to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt." That's because there were so many lies in this case, and this innocent man never stopped fighting. 8 years of his life is gone. His children are grown. This is the impact it has when a dirty cop spreads through a county. So this is an 11-minute clip. This is perfect. It'll take us up to our first 5-minute break. And the history that Jeremy Yachik provides will help you understand how difficult it is for even good cops who are accused and serve prison time, how difficult it is to get the truth out about what actually happened. But this is a great summary of Detective Brian Koopman and how he operates.
Did you have any first-hand interactions with Brian Koopman when he was Loveland Police Department officer?
Yeah, when I started out as the drug task force with their hazmat team, I was kind of handed to him as like a mentor, if you will. I had a lot of respect for him. I learned a lot from him. I mean, I've always known constitutional law and, right and wrong, what you do know as a cop. And for the most part, my interactions with him were on the up and up, and he didn't seem like he was far off in left field. When he rotated out of the task force and back to patrol, I would see him on occasion, we'd talk, and I'd meet up with him, at the very south end of the north end of our district, south end of Loveland. One time I had a lady pulled over, and I don't remember if I had arrested her or not, but I asked him a question, like since I was looking in the car for it, I was in the right for looking in the vehicle, but I asked him about the purse, and his response was, as long as you're not going to use anything you find in it for evidence, if it's just for intel. And I didn't look at the purse, and I'm not doing that. But it just seemed, that was kind of the first thing he said to me that seemed really off. Then he rotated back to the detective bureau, and he became their internet crime, sex crime dude, online crimes and shit I cat, right? So I remember going to going over there and meeting up with him there in the detective's office, and he's looking through, pictures of porn on somebody's, public drive or whatever, and he made the comment like, well, the best part of this job is you get to look at porn all day. And I'm thinking, well, you're looking for underage porn, so I'm not sure that that's the best part of the job. And then when all this stuff went down with my stuff, I felt, well, because I knew him, and he had known, because we spent time together professionally, and we talked, about our personal lives and stuff, so he knew what I was going through at home. So he asked me to come down and do an interview with him. And I can tell you that the number one rule should always be don't talk to the cops. Anything you say can be misquoted and used against you in court of law. So yeah, public service announcement, don't talk to the cops. But I went down and talked to him because I thought we were friends, and I thought that he had an understanding of what was going on, and that he'd be reasonable, and that he would see that my ex was just doing this to get the attention off of her and to get out of the charges that she had. And instead, what this guy did is he did this videotaped interview, promptly lost the videotape, and then lied on the arrest warrant, saying that I had admitted to doing all these things, which is 100% not the truth. And so then in the second case, because the DA's office didn't get what they wanted out of the first one, in the second one that they levied against me, they submitted it to us, that interview, in a 404B file that was buried in all of this other stuff, and it wasn't labeled as anything. And I had a really crappy attorney that didn't put the effort into reviewing the discovery that he should have. But that was one of the things that was brought up in that trial, was that, like, hey, this guy relied on that arrest warrant. And it was almost a mistrial because of that. And so it turns out that, like, well, we now have the video. Well, if you watch the video of that interview, and then you go back and look at what Koopman wrote in the arrest warrant, they're two different things. And when I got arrested on that first thing, under Koopman's warrant, I had him take me over to Loveland PD to book me in and book me out, spawn out. I read that, and I was calling Koopman to his face in the front lobby of the LPD that he was lying. I said, why? Because it was a huge betrayal. And it wasn't because he was a fellow cop, it was because I had considered him a friend. And that was just a huge betrayal. Like, you asked me if I did this, and I told you no. But you put in here that I told you yes. That is an out-and-out lie. Why did you do that? And he told me that if I knew what was best for me, I would shut up and I would leave, or else he would charge me with more charges. And I said, what, disorderly conduct for calling you out on what you're actually doing? It's like, okay, well, we'll deal with this in court. And then he promptly lost the video. So during that whole entire first case, we never had that video. Because had we had that video, I could have shown that I could have done, easily a 4 quarters argument on that warrant, that it was full of lies and falsities and misrepresentations, and that there wasn't probable cause there. And that would have gone away, but he hid it. And then it showed up probably about the same time that the video interview from that murder case where he got charged with felony perjury. And how he got a not guilty verdict on that felony perjury case is beyond me. Because that all went down shortly after my stuff went down. And I still am beside myself on how he got found not guilty, and then continued on for, 5 more years, 6 more years. Was never put on the Brady list in Marion County, but was in Will County. It's just really bizarre. So, I mean, I think they cover for who they want, and they hang out to dry the ones that they don't.
So when you first went to meet with Koopman, when he asked you to come in and talk to him, you went in there knowing that you were going to be videotaped?
Mm-hmm.
And if you would have gone in there knowing that you would not have been videotaped, would you have done it?
I would have asked him to record the interview. Because any interactions that I was going to have with law enforcement, where I was going to give a statement, I wanted recorded. And I used that interview room to interview people in, and so I know how that system works, and I know how their recording system works, and I know what the indicators are inside the room that it's recording, and that it was on the whole time. And so Koopman tried to say something like it didn't finalize right, or it didn't work, or whatever was his initial response, but then all of a sudden it showed up. So the system they have there is not a system that just breaks. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's no frills. Sometimes simpler is better. It's not a complicated system. And they use it all the time without having any issues with it. And then all of a sudden with mine, it just magically had a problem with it. But then the video still showed up, so.
So if that initial videotape would not have been so-called lost by Brian Koopman, if that initial videotape could have been used to compare against his affidavit, then what would have happened with your case?
Well, that one would have been, I think, dismissed.
Because of?
And if it wasn't dismissed, we'd have definitely wanted to take that to trial, because we'd have won that trial.
Because it was not, what Brian Koopman wrote in the affidavit does not match the truth, or didn't even match what was on the video.
Right. Didn't match what I was saying. Because the reason that there was probable cause in those 4 corners is because he says that I admitted to doing those things. That I confessed, and I never said that I did any of those things. So he's saying I admitted to that stuff, and I never did.
Do you think it was just a misunderstanding on Koopman's part?
No, that guy is so calculating and thinking all the time, many, many steps ahead. Yeah, there's no good faith without malice when it comes to Koopman. If he screws something up, he did it on purpose. Because he knows how to play the game, he knows to play the, oh, well, I didn't know. Yeah, like it's not, it was definitely malicious. And yeah.
It wasn't just a bumbling cop error.
Oh, no, he's not a bumbling cop. I mean, I will give it to Koopman. He's a very intelligent person. He's very, very smart. But I think he's, as my dad would say, too smart for his own good. He's very smart, but he also, is driven by, from what I can tell, accolades and awards and recognition and stuff, rather than just, doing the right thing and doing the job.
I'm going to read this. In June 2020, Jeremy Yachik's convictions were overturned by the Colorado Court of Appeals. The Colorado Court of Appeals said that the prosecuting attorneys Mitch Murray and Kara Boxberger crossed the line from permissible commentary on the evidence to impermissible commentary. The prosecuting attorneys in Mr. Yachik's case are no longer employed at the Judicial District Attorney's Office.
Do you think it was just a misunderstanding on Koopman's part?
No, that guy is so calculating and thinking all the time, many, many steps ahead. Yeah, there's no good faith without malice when it comes to Koopman. If he screws something up, he did it on purpose.
Mr. Yachik spent 1,395 days in prison.
I mean, it was a huge betrayal. And it wasn't because he was a fellow cop, it was because I had considered him a friend. And that was just a huge betrayal. Like, you asked me if I did this, and I told you no. But you put in here that I told you yes. That is an out-and-out lie. Why did you do that? And he told me that if I knew what was best for me, I would shut up and I would leave, or else he would charge me with more charges. And I said, what, disorderly conduct for calling you out on what you're actually doing? So, okay, well, we'll deal with this in court. And then he promptly lost the videos.
District Court Judge Gregory Lammons was found by the Colorado Court of Appeals to have committed error that was not harmless in Mr. Yachik's case. Do you see the pattern? Now, if you consider Tammy Fisher's lawsuit, where it was well known in the Loveland Police Department that Brian Koopman had control, it should be no surprise that Karen Garner happened, that other officers laughed about it and hid it, and that they shoot dogs without concern. The culture in the Loveland Police Department is rotten, and it's by design. And it's tragic. And the more we learn about how it happens and who is doing it, the quicker we can stop it. Because as you can see, it's not just innocent community members, it's fellow law enforcement officers who are really good people who have been destroyed. So somebody from inside the Loveland Police Department has been sending anonymous letters since 2015. This is the first one that was received by criminal defense attorney Troy Krenning. It was signed a Loveland cop. It explains how Koopman and Hecker and others in the department destroy evidence. It also talks about how Brian Koopman admits to illegally planting evidence and writing search warrants that are not valid. I received this anonymous letter also signed a good cop just before Brian Koopman's felony trial, and because the Weld County District Attorney were the prosecuting attorneys on Koopman's felony charge, I immediately took it to the gave it to the Weld County District Attorney as potential evidence because it outlines very disturbing facts about Brian Koopman and what he does inside the department and the pleasure he gets in scaring people and causing people pain. And just recently, a current criminal defense attorney who's handling yet another post-conviction relief process received an anonymous letter, also from a good cop. This one was a little bit different. It was on police department letterhead. And it includes, again, disturbing details about Brian Koopman's methods. So it's been very difficult to obviously find out who this person, the letter writer, is. And I understand why. You can see the retaliation that happens in Loveland PD for the officers who are honorable, who stand up. So this person obviously does not want to be identified, but the information that has been in each of the letters, I have been able to verify through records. So whoever this person is does know quite a bit about what happens inside LPD. So after Koopman was acquitted of his felony charge, the Weld County District Attorney's Office put Brian Koopman on the Brady list. Now remember, Brian Koopman has been an officer in Loveland since 2002, so everything he has done in his career has happened in Larimer County, outside of a few cases where he assisted in Weld County or on federal cases. The Brady list contains names of law enforcement officers who have been found to have a sustained pattern of lying. It's a legally classified determination, so it's not like you can just choose a person to put on the Brady list. You have to meet some federal guidelines for that. And Larimer County District Attorney, former DA Cliff Riedel, insisted for years that he had no evidence that Brian Koopman should be Brady listed. Even though a district attorney who prosecuted him for a felony Brady listed him immediately after Koopman's felony charge. This is Brian Koopman's, quote, retirement letter in April of 2021. Now remember, Koopman was hired in 2002, and it took until 2021 for him to be retired. This is what he says to Chief Ticer. I will continue to be here until that day, doing my best to pass the torch along to my peers, to continue our mission. It makes you wonder what his mission is. And what does Chief Ticer have to do with our mission? So how is it possible that Brian Koopman and other deviant officers remain on the job for so many years and through so many lawsuits and settlements? This is City Attorney Moses Garcia from Loveland. So what cities and counties do on a regular basis is they use what they call policies and regulations to subvert constitutional law and state law. It's one of the easiest ways for a city and county to hide wrongdoing by officials and employees. So City Attorney Moses Garcia actually says that he uses regulations to guide the interpretation of the law. So the law is itself the law. The interpretation that you refer to as an attorney or anytime you're doing legal research is you look at the case law that goes along with that law. You don't look at a regulation to understand the law or to interpret the law, but this is one of the tricks that's very effective. So because I was asking for Brian Koopman's personnel and employment files, and the city refused to provide those except in highly redacted form, I sued the city of Loveland. I explained to them at the outset that I was going to win this case and that I would be collecting fees and costs from them because they were going to lose. I've successfully sued in other jurisdictions for the very same records and won. I tried to save them money, but they refused to read the law and to understand the law, so we fought for 6 months. This is a short video of the redacted version. You'll see what they provided initially before I had to sue them, and then you'll see at the end the unredacted. So redacted just means that they cover up everything they don't want you to see.
Holy shit.
And this is the unredacted. Makes you wonder, makes you really want to see what's redacted, right? So as soon as an agency refuses to provide unredacted records and I get all black boxes and black pages, pretty much a guarantee I'm not going to stop looking for it. Just a heads up. So this is District Court Judge Juan Villa Sr. He handled the district court lawsuit against the city of Loveland. He was a former federal prosecutor. He actually turned out to be the best judge we could have possibly gotten. And this is what he said at the show cause hearing. Fabulous. This is worth framing for me. Because it took 20 years for a local judge to tell the truth about Brian Koopman. This is Judge Villa Sr. I'll tell you one thing. Had he been a federal law enforcement officer, he would never have had a job, acquittal or not. I can tell you that, because he would have been giglio compromised. It's because the federal prosecutor's offices would have said, hell no, you're not touching evidence were to save your life. Because now, even though you were acquitted, I have to issue a Giglio letter to the defense saying that this whole thing happened. He would never touch evidence again. I am frankly very surprised that he went back to his work and continued working as though nothing happened. Finally, somebody in the district court in Larimer County put the truth on the record about Brian Cooper and what in the world is going wrong with Loveland Police Department. This is the order that was issued by Judge Villasenor on January 3rd. And because the city of Loveland throughout the 6-month process with Judge Villasenor continually lied to a district court judge, continually lied on the witness stand, in filings, in documents, Judge Villasenor, his very last sentence, quote, the court will closely scrutinize Loveland's redactions. He doesn't trust the city of Loveland either. And these are little bits of justice for everybody in this community. For a district court judge to say, I'm watching you. So the city complied with Judge Villasenor orders on January 24th, the very last day they had to meet the deadline, and they provided Brian Coogan's unredacted employment file narratives. And this is a great place for us to take our first 5-minute break, so if you need to, if you need to take a break, please do that. So if you all had time to think about what the city of Loveland was hiding in all those black boxes, remember Koopman's history is pretty graphic. All the different cases you've heard about so far, and again, that's just 1% of the totality of the cases the people brought forward. Do you think they were hiding all the evaluations, the personnel findings about Brian Coogan? Is that what it was? Not what they were hiding. The city tried to hide the fact that Brian Coogan's employment files contained no references to his felony charge, no comments about his numerous legal settlements, no mention of his multiple lawsuits, and no negative reviews whatsoever. That's what they were hiding. Instead, Brian Coogan's employment file is filled with praise, adoration, constant worshiping of the work that Brian Coogan does. That means Brian Coogan, in writing, looks like the most perfectly honorable law enforcement officer to ever walk on this planet.
Do you think they scrubbed it?
So, like I said, I'll do questions at the end because I do respect there's a lot of curiosity, especially around this particular section, but please write them down and we'll do uncensored questions. So remember that Judge Villasenor said he'd be closely watching what the city of Loveland did with these files and how they unredacted them. And Judge Villasenor 6 months ago got a copy of Brian Coogan's unredacted files so that he could make the determination whether or not the public interest would be served or harmed by the release of these files. So Judge Villasenor had the files for a very long time. He knows what was in them. And that's why he ordered them to be disclosed. But remember this. Remember Lieutenant Brent Eubanks, former supervisor for Brian Coogan, now the chief of the Meade Police Department? He says if it's not in writing, it's as if it doesn't exist. So the best thing to do in a police officer's file is to not put anything negative in writing. And so that when anybody goes to look at his file, there is no record of a problem in the Loveland Police Department. That's how corruption keeps living, and that's how it gets deeper and deeper. This is a GPS tracking device that was discovered underneath my vehicle. The Weld County Sheriff's Office traced the serial numbers back to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. The Weld County Sheriff's Office explained to me there was no warrant for the tracker. It was on my vehicle for 5 months. There was never a warrant for that tracker. And various professionals over the course of nearly a decade requested those records on that tracking device from the sheriff's office. And the answer always came back the same. There are no responsive records. There were no records about the placement of that tracking device. The Fort Collins, Colorado editorial board wrote that they believed the GPS tracking device was retaliation for my work. And just as a side note, the Fort Collins, Colorado does not care much for my work, so the fact they concluded that was quite a big deal. So even on October 23rd of 2019, 8 years after the tracker was attached, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office said they were unable to locate any records. They still couldn't find records. A couple weeks later, County Attorney David Arode said there are no records, and then in the same sentence explained how they had hidden those records for 8 years. Remember, Lieutenant Brett Newbanks and Sheriff Justin Smith in 2015 held that really special Fourth Amendment educational forum to teach people about the Fourth Amendment, how important it is to have your rights to privacy protected. So 8 years after the illegal placement of that GPS tracking device on my vehicle, Dion's son, the records custodian at the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, provided 37 pages of records on the tracker that Sheriff Justin Smith and County Attorney David Arode said do not exist. This is the federal lawsuit that was filed against John Fain, Justin Smith, Josh Sheldon, Troy Miller, David Arode, and the Board of County Commissioners. The basis of the claim: conspiracy to prevent access to the courts and Fourth Amendment violations. They had hidden those records for 8 years so that I could not sue, among other reasons. So this is the very short video. This is the record that Sheriff Justin Smith, Assistant Chief John Fain, and County Attorney David Arode conspired to hide for 8 years. And it's what's inside that record that explains why they were hiding it. This is the record that didn't exist for 8 years. It actually was held in a secret file. Lou Gator, the former Larimer Board of County Commissioner and close friend of Sheriff Justin Smith, said that Smith was lying about the tracker. Smith claimed the tracker was never turned on and never collected data. Gator, an IT professional, said the tracker was on and collecting data. Tragically, Lou Gator died in 2018, 1 year before the hidden records were disclosed. Those records prove that Lou Gator was telling the truth and that Sheriff Justin Smith is a liar. And I wish Lou was here to see it. County Attorney David Arode tells Brad Harkin, Robert Coleman, Jonathan Cox, John Fain, Joseph Shellhammer, and Andy Josie to keep the GPS unit in evidence, secured in IA for at least 2 years past the date of the incident, plus an additional 6 months for good measure, and to assure all statutes of limitations have expired. There it is in plain sight. They kept it hidden so that all of these statute of limitations had expired and I could not sue. So full circle corruption. It makes sense that Sheriff Justin Smith is supporting John Fain as a candidate for sheriff. They share similar approaches to law enforcement. Break the law, hide it for as long as possible, and then lie about it when you get caught. And we're going to wrap up our evidence section with a really important portion on the Colorado Commission on Judicial Discipline. I don't know how familiar you are with the process for remedy in the state of Colorado, but once you discover that a judge is troubled as far as following the law, your only recourse basically that people are aware of is to file a complaint. So you basically file a complaint with the bosses of that troubled judge. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that you can actually sue a judge in the state of Colorado, and I'm not an attorney, I'm not giving you legal advice, but I have done it, and I can tell you that it's a process that you can do. It's quite entertaining. So this is a 5-minute video specifically talking about the Judicial Commission. They've been in the news recently because they're trying to make some changes to improve that system, but it's going to take a little bit more work. Let's start by talking about the envelope you have in front of you. Who is that from?
This is from the Colorado Commission of Judicial Discipline. And it contained a letter denying my request for an investigation
signed that letter from the Judicial Commission?
Yes, this was signed by Mr. William J. Campbell, who was the executive director of the Colorado Commission on Judicial Discipline at that time.
And on the envelope, could you show us that envelope again? And I just want people to notice that it says confidential on the envelope. So even the contents of that letter are clearly marked confidential.
Correct.
And are you choosing to talk about this openly now?
Absolutely. I have spoken about it openly almost 10 years ago, except that certain people thought that it would not be a good thing to do at that time. It would muddy the waters more.
And so when you received this letter, what was the letter in response to?
I had prepared a request for a judicial investigation, it's entitled Request for Judicial Discipline Investigation. And I prepared this request regarding Julie Kunzfield, the Judicial District of Colorado, because in the time frame of the hearing, I guess you'd call it custody hearing or whatever, and the time that when the orders came out, when I actually went to the courthouse and got them for the mother, the day after Tom Bay had said that she had them, I read those orders, and I can remember where I was sitting in the coffee house, and I can remember the feeling that I had. I looked at, read the orders, and I said, was this judge sitting in the same room I was sitting in? Because this is crazy.
And what did William Campbell say on the last page of his letter? What did he say about the confidentiality of these proceedings?
You know, and to this day, I don't know why. It was one of those things that I'm going to end. I'll read the last paragraph. Our records and proceedings are confidential, as required by Article 6, Section 23(3)(g) of the Colorado Constitution. Therefore, it will not be necessary or appropriate for the Commission, you, your colleagues, or the mother, to disclose your complaint or its dismissal to Judge Field, or to publish this letter online or otherwise. Although we have no grounds for disciplinary action, the Commission welcomes comments from litigants and the community about their experience with the courts, and we thank you for contacting us. So that's a veiled threat that this should not be made public.
How did you interpret it as a threat?
Well, this is an official person from the courts, the Colorado Commission on Judicial Discipline, State of Colorado seal, came from the Colorado Supreme Court.
And the envelope, let's revisit the envelope. What does the envelope say?
Confidential, Colorado Commission on
So William Campbell was telling you not to talk?
Right. Or it will not be necessary or appropriate for them, the Commission, me, my colleagues, or the mother, to disclose the complaint or its dismissal.
And so you're deciding to...
And I thought, well, show me a law that says we can't. And while I understand the power that the courts wield in our lives, rightly or wrongly, corrupt or uncorrupt, I'll stand on what's right. And I don't care who knows. So I don't care. I go to jail for right, because in history, nothing ever changed unless somebody was willing to do something and stand up for right. So this is one of the things that I think people need to understand regarding corruption in our politics. That's one thing. We know politicians are corrupt. I mean, we were weaned on that stuff, that politicians are corrupt. But until your own office is court, until
start by talking. So the Colorado Commission on Judicial Discipline, and this woman is choosing to go public with this at this point. She has no fear of going public, even though she was threatened. And those are threats. When you file a complaint with the Colorado Commission on Judicial Discipline, you're told not to talk about it, or else. They leave that part unspoken, of course. So Julie Coonsfield has a long history in the 8th Judicial District. Not only did she protect Ryan Koopman repeatedly, her rulings are mind-boggling destructive to families in Monroe County. So this actual complaint will be published online without fear, and you'll be able to see that on Facebook along with a lot of these other documents after this, the end of this event. So let's talk about some solutions. And we're going to get, as we go through solutions, we're going to show you a little bit more of the evidence on the problems, but it's going to be solution-based. So always go for contracts. Read the contracts. You got to get the contracts, read the contracts. And I'm just going to use the most recent contract as an example. Jensen Hughes recently completed a 6-month investigation into the city of Loveland and the Loveland Police Department. Because of all the attention Loveland has gotten recently, and nationally, internationally, it took that much just to get the city to hire a so-called third-party investigator. Interestingly, the contract expired on November 30th, and most of the Loveland people in the room know that the final report wasn't issued until January. So there was a 2-month period where Jensen Hughes was operating without a valid contract. And when that happens, what it gives to the contractors who are operating under that is it gives them bargaining power, it gives them leverage to charge the taxpayers a lot more. So when I asked for the contract extension, it was interesting what the city said. The city clerk's office could not provide the contract extension because the negotiation process is confidential and the city has not signed the document. That was on January 20th. So they were in negotiations. The new contract is valid until February 15th and cost the taxpayers an additional nearly $48,000 for a total amount of $200,000. No records of the stakeholders that Jensen Hughes interviewed are in the possession of the city. So we don't actually know who Jensen Hughes interviewed to come to their conclusions. Jensen Hughes failed to conduct interviews with people who have facts and evidence of the actual problems inside LPD, and I know that because I have a very long list of people who have inside information who were not contacted by Jensen Hughes. So that report is meaningless. But it makes a lot of people feel good because they hired a third-party investigator to look into the problems. So, solutions. We started off with some great, hopeful news from the district attorney's office, the new administration. The process called vertical prosecution. And vertical prosecution is used by district attorney's offices who are concerned about the integrity of their cases. Vertical prosecution means in a high-profile felony case, the same district attorney takes the case from the very beginning and follows it all the way through to the end. A lot of times in, I know for a fact in Cliff Riedel and Larry Abrahamson's administrations, that didn't happen. You had numerous district attorneys on cases that spanned a decade, so there was no continuity, and it was one of the easiest ways for, especially innocent defendants, to get stuck in the system. We had constant changes in the district attorney. So the new district attorney's office is implementing vertical prosecution. That's a great first step. We need to overhaul our Brady list. So Brady lists are basically how the district attorney in every jurisdiction keeps track of the problem officers, but there's no standard way for officers to be listed. And the one thing I learned from DA McLaughlin was that the district attorney never has access to the information that puts an officer on a list. So that DA has a list of officers, but he doesn't know why they're there. There's no standard method for applying the label. So we have to overhaul that process statewide, so that no matter which jurisdiction you go to, you have the same, you know that if you have an officer on a Brady list, they're on there for a reason that's legitimate. So this is the Brady list that DA McLaughlin's office released, and the prior two administrations for the previous 20 years refused to release the list of Brady officers in Laramie County in the 8th Judicial District. I'll point this out because we're just going to flip through it quickly, but there's no standard process for having a name on here. And as I went through each name and the agency they came from, I noticed that until 2021, there were no Loveland Police Department officers on the Brady list. That's not even close to making sense with the reality. And there's also a disproportionate number of female officers. So if you look at the number of female officers in policing in general, and the number that are on this list, it's out of balance. I know there are some names on this list that were placed on here for retaliation. So a lot of times when a good cop will come forward and try to help take care of a problem officer by going up the chain of command and using the approved department policies for problem officers, a lot of times those cops will get retaliated against. So there are some of those people on this as well. And again, I'll post all of this online. This is just to show you how many names are on here that Cliff Riedel and Larry Abrahamson refused to release. And really, these names don't mean anything. There's no standard procedure for getting an officer's name on this list or off this list. And remember, the district attorney doesn't even know why they're on here. There's no information that is filed with the listing that explains what the officer did to get his name here. So prosecution integrity units. So what happens in a prosecution integrity unit, again, that is applied by the district attorney's office, that means that when a case is completed, verdict is in, plea has been taken, then the office will go back and review the case to make sure that everything has been properly done. The law has been followed, all the facts are out, everything's clean. The problem with the prosecution integrity units is it's one step too late, because all of the damage is done in the initial stages before charges even come down, or before a verdict is in, or before a plea is taken. So prosecution integrity units are a great step, but it's one step too late. So conviction integrity units is a very upstream way of thinking, and it actually applies to preventing a prosecution integrity unit from even being necessary. So upstream solutions mean that you try to stop all of these downstream problems. And a conviction integrity unit is one of those fabulous upstream solutions. It protects innocent people much more than a prosecution integrity unit does. So full public access to judicial investigations and complaints, that will open up the problems we have in our judges especially in the state of Colorado. Everything that judges do is basically confidential, and any complaints are hidden from the public. Like I mentioned before, Judge Villaseñor is the first district court judge to have the courage and the understanding of the law to actually talk frankly and honestly about Brian Koopman and how the city of Loveland basically blew his mind for allowing him to stay employed. So we need full public access to these judges. Learn how to file public records requests at the state, local, and federal level. And then once you do those, once you learn how to file them, learn how to use them to expose what's actually happening. And it takes a lot of effort once you get the record to understand how to use the data. Say no to magistrates. So magistrates are a big problem in the state of Colorado. A magistrate is simply an attorney who has been hired by the chief judge. There's no accountability by the people to oversee a magistrate. When you consent to a magistrate hearing your case, even in a traffic case, you waive your constitutional rights. But in the state of Colorado, it's an opt-out system instead of an opt-in. So you automatically are assumed to consent to a magistrate unless you know there's a law that says you don't have to. So learn about magistrates. Talk to your attorney about what a magistrate is and how to avoid a magistrate at all costs. So magistrates can actually arbitrarily choose which rights you are given in the courtroom. Judges are forced to comply with the rights that are in the Constitution. The magistrates have an amazing amount of powers to change the law on the fly. And I spent the last 15 years in courtrooms throughout the state of Colorado, and it's amazing what a magistrate can do to a life. So this is an example, Magistrate Pinnell in the Judicial District. She told a woman in open court that she did not have a right to a jury trial, even though that woman was facing jail time. On this very same day, Judge Carney, Christine Carney, had a public meeting where she said that the Colorado Constitution guarantees our right to a jury trial if jail time is being faced. So a magistrate saying you don't have a right, later that day the judge is saying you are absolutely guaranteed the right. So Mary Jo Baronato, as a magistrate, she proudly refused on a regular basis to consider evidence before she issued her rulings. Then she became a county court judge, and as a county court judge, she actually used her signature to dismiss a district court judge's case. It's illegal because she doesn't have a jurisdiction. But once a magistrate gets in their idea that they can make up the law on the fly, when they're magistrates, they continue that in their as their judges. So the solutions: remain silent, especially if you're innocent. You know, your former officer, he actually tell you, don't talk to the cops. And case after case after case of these innocent men that I learned about, they talk to the cops because they're innocent. And they just want the cops to know they'll do everything they can to help them. So don't talk, especially if you're innocent. Don't talk to anybody without an attorney. Do not try to explain how innocent you are. And that's our human nature. We want to explain how innocent we are. We want to help the cops catch the real bad guy. And that backfires every time. So remain silent, especially if you're guilty. That should go without saying. But a lot of these, the guilty guys will just go and talk and talk and talk, thinking that they're going to outsmart the system. It's not possible. All right, so if you find yourself where you're detained or arrested, do not ask the officers questions, because as soon as you ask a question, you're waiving your right to remain silent. And those questions will be twisted and used against you. That's just how the system works. That part's not inherently evil, but it will hurt you. So do not ask questions. It's a waiver of your rights. All right, dissect your own case. If you find yourself in the system, dissect your own case as if your life depends on it, because it actually does. Especially in Maryland County, where we seem to have a special hold on corruption. You are responsible for knowing everything there is to know. Don't rely on your attorney to understand the facts, because the facts that may be in your file may not be complete or accurate. Don't talk, if you find yourself in jail, arrested, don't talk to anyone in jail about your case, because snitches are real. And they're effective. And they're really good at what they do because they have a lot to gain. So everything you say, like you heard Officer Yachik say, it's going to be twisted and remixed and distorted and used against you. And it's hard as innocent, law-abiding people to remember that. Because we trust people and we want to help. Don't try to help yourself in those situations. Talk to your attorney about ditching all magistrates. If you ever have a magistrate, try to get your attorney to understand. And there's a simple form on the judicial website that everybody can use. It's JDF 405. It's form 405. All you do is mark a box and say you want a judge to hear your case, because that's the law in Colorado. But if you walk into any magistrate's courtroom, they will make you feel like you are an alien asking for something they've never heard of before. But we all have a right to a judge. That's the Constitution. All right, remember, guilty verdicts do not mean the defendant is guilty. And this is one of the most fabulous things about what I've done for the past 15 years, and that is to keep my mind open to the facts, to the evidence, and not assume just because there's a guilty verdict that that person's actually guilty. It has helped a great deal in my work. Also, acquittals do not mean the defendant is innocent. Just because somebody gets an acquittal, a lot of times that person actually just got away with it. So we really have to keep our minds open about what the judicial system means and what a verdict means and what it doesn't mean. Plea bargains are taken by innocent people all the time because the risk of going to trial is expensive. They can't afford the risk of jail time, so they'll just take a plea bargain. That's a big problem in the system. Never confuse justice with the law. There's a big difference. Especially when the law is used to achieve agendas instead of justice. And in an investigation like for Brian Koopman, the very first move in his investigation is usually based on something that's not accurate, and everything that happens after that, you cannot rely on. Because the very first step that goes wrong impacts every other step. And many times the district attorneys have been completely destroyed because of cases involving Brian Koopman. Because they trusted him, like the judge trusted him. So district attorneys in the district attorney's office will be dealing for decades the fallout of Brian Koopman. We started with this, but this is one of the most exciting things because the mindset of the district attorney's office in the 8th Judicial District has changed. And that mindset that I'm so focused on right now is that they understand the public has to understand the system. That means you open up the records. That's why it was so amazingly heartwarming to get the Brady list from this new administration. Because the two previous administrations had hidden it. So what happens to injustice in a community? And these cases like I showed you today and so many others in Larimer County are causing multi-generational damages because there's never a resolution. There's never an end point. The trauma never ends for people who are innocent and who've been prosecuted. They'll fight forever just for the truth to be seen. And the amount of emotional damage that takes on a community there's no way you can measure it. So if you know people who have been victims of the system, understand that they will never rest until somebody believes them, until the evidence is actually proven. And that can destroy you. It can take your life. Sheriff Justin Smith, Assistant Chief Police Chief John Fain, and County Attorney David Abram were invited to share their side of the GPS tracking story. They provided no answers to multiple requests for interviews. The people in the next photo continue to hide records of crimes that have been committed by officials, including crimes committed by themselves. And you should know right now, I don't say something unless I have the evidence. So the people on this next photo, all of the people, know they've committed crimes and they know they're hiding evidence. Justin Smith, Larry Abrahamson, Julie Coons Field, Cliff Riedel, Luke Hecker, Bob Tyson, Brian Koopman, John Fain, and David Abram. So I'm going to end, and then we're going to do the fun part. The fun part for me is the questions, uncensored. I just want to tell you that I have immense gratitude for the hundreds of people who have opened their lives to me, so that I can get to this point where we know who's doing what and how, so that we can have solutions that are real. Countless law enforcement officers have shared their stories as well, and for obvious reasons. Most of them are not going to publicly associate themselves with me. They know who they are. It's an amazing group of people who are fighting for justice as well. Since I advertised this event, a lot of people contacted me with new cases, and they're compelling. So this has given a lot of new people a voice. And I just want them to know these are very tragic, traumatic cases, and I want you to know to stay focused. You're not alone. There's so much suffering because of corruption in the city of Loveland and Loveland County. So much suffering. And it's easy to feel like you're the only one being attacked. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to write your questions, and you're going to throw them in that basket in the back so it's completely anonymous. Please be as direct and as forward and as specific as you would like. I have no fear of the questions. So 5 minutes, throw them in the back, and then we'll start the fun part. All right, are all the questions that wanted to be up here up here? I'm just going to start pulling. So there's a question, what do you think about the other candidate for sheriff? I'm going to assume that this means, what do I think about Jeff Fisher, who is a candidate for sheriff? And it's ironic, I was just talking in the hallway with some people who said they're very troubled by the information about Justin Smith and John Fayette. And they said, well, what do we do with that as Republicans? And well, it's kind of awkward, of course, but there's evidence of their criminal behavior. So what the Republican Party does with that, I guess time will tell. But what do I think about Jeff Fisher? So whenever I report on something, I dissect that person as well. And I know that Jeff Fisher is clean, which is very difficult to say about many candidates, but he's clean. And the fact that he's focused on the Constitution, that he wants to focus on constitutional law and basically bringing some civility back to policing, I guess, is encouraging. So that's my short story on what I think about the other candidate for sheriff. John Fayen's 8 years of lying and hiding evidence of his criminal activity is, I don't know how you're a sheriff and you get past that. I don't know how you reconcile that. And this is a great question. And one of the things that you heard Officer Yachik talk about how the betrayal is so deep. That betrayal you just don't get over. And a lot of I for about 2 years worked on the homeless community issues in Fort Collins. I was investigating, the money problems there and why the homeless community was being just brutally abused by the city of Fort Collins. And during that process, John Fayen and I started working together because he's the assistant chief of police in Fort Collins, and that was one of his areas of specialties. So even though we had this very long history, I had no idea when I was working with John Fayen that he was the one who put the tracking device on my car and then lied to me for 8 years. I had no idea that it was him. So working closely with him on solving a social problem and then realizing that it was him who did it, that kind of breach of character, I don't see how you overcome that. So that's my thoughts on the other candidate. He's clean. And so I've looked at all the lawsuits for Jeff Fisher. I've looked at Tammy's lawsuits. These are all public records. I've looked at their history with the Loveland Police Department. And by the way, you can see Jeff and Tammy Fisher on the Loveland Police Department wall on the plaques where they've done amazing things for the community. So they're solid officers who were really hurt by Brian Koopman and Luke Hecker and the administration who kept the corruption going and tossed out the good cops. Next question. What information do you have about improvements about discovery abuses and prosecutorial misconduct? So let me see if I understand this. So since McLaughlin was elected, what improvements have been made about discovery abuses? and prosecutorial misconduct. So I'm not speaking for DA Loveland at all, but I do know from meeting with him and also from watching the office closely over the past year that there are radical changes inside the district attorney's office that are positive. They're much more vigilant about making sure a case is clean from the beginning, and if it's not clean, it's tossed. Brian Koopman's cases are being tossed. He's not, the DA's office has inherited 20 years of corruption from DA Riedel and DA Abrahamson. So there's no way in 1 year he can clean house and fix it. And he's done phenomenal things by changing the structure and the foundation of the office so that as each day passes and each new case gets brought to him, it's cleaner and cleaner. Why did John Fain become acting chief of Berthoud? So the Laramie County Sheriff's Office took control of the Berthoud Police Department because there were a lot of problems with accusations with how the chief was handling internal complaints. So there were, it was basically an implosion of the Berthoud Police Department. But as you heard Jeremy Yajic say, the Sheriff's Office had wanted control of Berthoud for a long time anyway because there was a lot more money involved. And I'll post the full unedited video of Mr. Yajic in the next few days so that you can actually see how that all happened and why the Sheriff's Office was motivated to take control of Berthoud. And Mr. Yajic had a great point where it was a small town, a real local agency, where he and the few other officers in the Berthoud Police Department actually had relationships with the community. And that relationship, that positive relationship no longer exists because the Sheriff's Office is taking control. So Berthoud lost a lot when they lost their local office. In various cases, what did Koopman have to gain? In various cases, what did Koopman have to gain? Ego or money? For Brian Koopman, it looks like it was both. He loved the awards. He got awards constantly. He was recognized in the paper so many times. The Loveland Reporter Herald just loved to celebrate Brian Koopman. As far as money, he got a lot of promotions. So he did make more money the more successful he got, the more notoriety. But it sounds like from officers inside that I can tell you that most officers use the word sociopath and psychopath for the way Brian Koopman is driven. He's driven by something that most people are not driven by. And that is what scares the officers, and really a lot of the officers toward the end refused to do cases with Brian Koopman because it ended up hurting their careers. Do you believe this level of corruption within the Justice Department is directly linked to the Loveland City Council? If so, what is that link? So the level of corruption in the Loveland Police Department started at least 20 years ago. So there have been many councils that have changed since that time. But everybody in Loveland knows that some of the same people are still there. They just keep getting elected, and you think like 20 years have gone by and you're still seeing the same people on city council. That's always a problem, to have the same core group of people that are always in leadership and authority positions, because it's just human behavior that feeds corruption. So there's a core group, not only in the city council, but in the city management that is controlling, that is not helping the city of Loveland Police Department clean up. I will say that Bob Tyser has known since the very first day he took the job about Brian Koopman's history, and I know that because I met with Bob Tyser the very first time he arrived in Loveland. We had a sit-down meeting with Officer Tim Brown, who was the interim chief at the time, and I presented all of this evidence to him, with much more evidence from the inside. And Bob Tyser chose not to do anything. He chose to leave Brian Koopman on that force, and now he's paying for it. Because Brian Koopman had influence over all of the officers, including Officer Hopp, Officer Jalali, the entire Karen Garner. Brian Koopman was involved in all of those horrific cases. able to somewhat identify who the good people are in this fight as comfortable as you are identifying the bad actors? Would be helpful in the case support, legal and otherwise. Oh, okay, so like basically who can you rely on? Who can you trust? And I make it a policy to not ever recommend an attorney unless I know your case inside and out and I know that attorney inside and out. Because you can get into a lot of trouble with attorneys and recommendations and referrals because attorneys have a very difficult time representing people in Larimer County. Because the history of the district attorney's office and the history of law enforcement officers here is so challenging. So imagine you're a criminal defense attorney and a client comes to you with the facts. How are you going to prove that those facts are not accurate when the police and the judge and the DA are all saying that your client is guilty? So it's very challenging for criminal defense attorneys. So I don't recommend attorneys unless I have your case inside and out. As far as the good people, you know inherently who they are, right? You know there are people in the Loveland City Council who you can go to and trust. You know there are officers of the Loveland Police Department who, it's usually the quiet ones, you don't hear a lot about them, but you know you can walk up to them and say, I'm in trouble here, help me out. So you have to get back to trusting what you know. And if you have a specific question about a specific person, I am happy to talk with you about that. I can tell you, I won't give you my opinion, I'll give you facts and evidence about what I have on that person. Because I avoid giving my opinion about what I think about somebody. But I can tell you what I know for a fact. How to get a review of any and all cases with dirty cops? That's a great question. So like I said, Brian Cooper has nearly 900 cases where he's the lead detective in Larimer County. Can you imagine being District Attorney Gordon McLaughlin and understanding, oh dear God, every single case needs to be reviewed? Because legitimately that's what needs to be done. Every single case has to be reviewed. And that is why Judge Villasenor was so shocked that Brian Cooper continued to work. Because every case has to be reviewed. So if you have a case that you know an officer is either on the Brady list or has a personnel file or employment file that's troublesome, get your case reviewed. Even prosecutors hide evidence, get convictions, and never answer for prosecutorial misconduct. That's where the power of public records comes in. Because I know there are a number of cases where Brian Koopman is involved where without this publicity, those cases would just keep going, struggling, never been solved, never been resolved, never been dismissed. Those cases would still be tormenting these innocent people. So publicity matters. And the public records, and I'll give you an example. So this is one of the most powerful lawsuits I've ever had. This is Brian Koopman's unredacted records. So what this means to everybody who's ever been hurt by Brian Koopman is phenomenal. You would think, oh, it's just his employment file. But what it shows is that it shows who covered up his crimes, it shows how they did it, and it shows why they did it. I'll give you an example. In the It Was Sugar Stupid case, that was a big deal. It was a sensational case. Everybody loved it. It hurt that family. It's still hurting that family. But guess what Brian Koopman's supervisor said about it? Excellent job taking down the meth lab. What? That's what's in here. That's what the city of Loveland did not want me to know. Excellent job taking down that meth lab. No mention of the crimes that happened. No mention of the fact that Brian Koopman lost the lawsuit. So public records can swing this ship into the right direction. So this is a statement, I'm going to read it because I'm not censoring anything. This says Child Protective Services are the worst offenders of constitutional rights protections. Family court magistrates allow it. Remember that word magistrate. So magistrates in Larimer County are actually taking children without protecting or even recognizing the fact that parents have constitutional rights. Magistrates are doing all of that family law work in Larimer County. Law enforcement must stop trusting the caseworkers that have so-called supporting evidence. They lie in court during trials and ex parte hearings. And I'm going to tell you, I have a new case that came to me. This is a phenomenal example. I went to the court to get the file. Somebody had already asked for the file, and so all the redactions were already done. So you can redact, obviously, victim names, you can redact minor names, all of those things are legal redactions. But when I got the redactions, and this was a child case, I noticed that it looked like Brian Koopman's redactions. Like it was all black. There was none, you couldn't read anything in the file. And so I asked the head court clerk to review the redactions. And sure enough, he looked at it and he said, this doesn't seem right. So this stellar court clerk went back and did an actual legal redaction of that case file and immediately gave me the records. There was no fight involved. He just knew that something wasn't right. And in the new redactions, it paints a radically different picture about these parents who had been falsely accused. So the original redactions made it look like these parents were the worst human beings on this planet and they should just be shot. But when you get the file and it's not redacted, you can see where the police officers lied and how they lied and actually what happened. It's shocking. Shocking. So yes, this law enforcement officers have to stop trusting caseworkers. You have to stop trusting anybody involved in the system, especially in Larimer County. And that doesn't mean you're paranoid. It just means you recognize the reality of this county. It's not just criminally seen issues, but to serve and protect. How do we make it so police are trusted to call in an emergency or when needed and not scared they will find a reason to arrest somebody? Those are legitimate concerns. Where you are the victim and then you become the suspect or the subject or the accused. And I've seen that happen in cases where you innocently call for help and then all of a sudden you're the one being interrogated. So you don't even feel like you can talk to the police about the facts in the case because it's been flipped on you. So when you're doing a situation like that, again, trust yourself. If you feel like that officer is maybe not understanding the situation, you can ask for another officer. You can ask for another officer. Say, no offense, but we need to get this on the right track. And I know there's a high-profile Koopman case right now that is is going through the post-conviction appeal process. And that family actually repeatedly called the Loveland Police Department for help because they were getting threats, they were getting, people were breaking into their house, they were constantly being harassed. And the police, under the leadership of Brian Koopman, refused to follow up on any of those calls. And I have 3 volumes of notebooks of files from the police where they called every time to ask for help. And then it turned out that he ended up getting prosecuted for a crime that he didn't commit because Brian Koopman fabricated the evidence. So that's how troubled the Loveland Police Department is. And then when an officer did step up in Loveland and say, why aren't you guys calling? Why aren't you guys responding to these calls and helping this family with these threats and the harassment? Those officers got retaliated against. Why haven't you gone to the state attorney, Phil Weiser, with this information? So I don't ever comment on which agencies or who else has the information I have. And I do that for protection for myself and also for the people that I protect their cases. So Whether I've gone to those people or not, I don't comment on. And if that doesn't make sense, and you feel like I'm being evasive, please nail me on that, but I just want you to understand that there are a lot of agencies involved, especially with Larimer County, because whatever's happening in Larimer County is impacting the whole state, and it's basically collapsing. It's imploding, because we're to the point now where there are other agencies that are deeply concerned. And this part is not confidential whatsoever, but District Attorney Gordon McLaughlin said that the Department of Justice was involved in the city of Loveland. Not very many people know that, but it matters. What can we as citizens do to assist in uncovering and bringing to light any corruption within the LPD, Chief Ticer specifically? So Chief Ticer is really interesting. He when I met with him and Chief Brown on the first day of his job, first week of his job, Interim Chief Brown had not even told Chief Ticer that Brian Cooper was Brady listed. And it was a pretty big deal to have a Brady listed officer on your force. That's the first thing you want to know about. Even having one on your force is unheard of in most jurisdictions because you can't afford to have a Brady cop on your force. But nobody had told Chief Ticer until I sat down and met with him that Brian Cooper was Brady listed. And that began the very first crack in the trust that Chief Ticer had with the city of Loveland, because his own ranking officers didn't tell him that he had a Brady cop on his force. So he didn't really have a chance coming in, but I also think that Ticer underestimated the depths of corruption there. And there is a certain level of legitimate fear for one's career and future when you come forward in Loveland. So I'm not saying I condone it, but I do respect it. So what can you do to bring it to light? Keep asking for records. Anytime you have an officer that you feel like was treating you unfairly or was just a red flag in your gut, learn how to get their files. And now that we have this great ruling by Judge Villasenor, it's going to be a lot easier to get files from the city of Loveland. So just start getting employment files on all these cops, on all the officers. Every single officer that you ever question. And it may seem like, well, that's a lot of work for them. That's their job, and they asked for it. The more they hide, the more they cover up, the more you're going to ask for the records. It's in the records, people. Public records are phenomenal. Who paid for today's room? That's funny. You appear to be an independent journalist. How do you earn a living? That's kind of awkward. I didn't expect it. So I can tell you that I am an independent journalist. How do I earn a living? I don't ever take money from any of the cases because I want to be completely clean, totally clean. And that frustrates people. Even I've had people offer to buy me a hamburger, and I'm like, no, you can't buy me a hamburger. So how do I make a living? I can tell you that. Well, let me answer it this way. I'm hoping this is my last event so that I can recover some financial needs. But it's amazing. Raise your hand if you know what a pit maneuver is. A pit maneuver. So if you're in law enforcement, a pit maneuver is a maneuver that you learn how to do to disable a suspect's car or stop a car. It's a weird story, but this will answer your question directly. So a few years ago, a pit maneuver was done on my car, actually the same one that had the tracking device on it. And it was a full-size Ford Expedition SUV. Pit maneuver done in the middle of Fort Collins, middle of the day. Flipped in, rolled 5 times, landed in a front yard. Totaled the car. But you know what's amazing? I blacked out when I hit the window because I hit the window really hard. It was gone for a while. But when I came to, I was hanging upside down. And these amazing people came and pulled off the windshield. I had a hearing the next day I had to go to. So I came to and I'm like, I gotta get out of this car. These amazing people came and pulled off the windshield, helped me get out. But because of that maneuver that was done on my car, I was actually able to fund 2 documentary films on Ben Gilmore's case. So, when you ask how I make a living, Occasionally I have car crashes. I use the money instead of buying a car. And since then I haven't owned a car because people keep coming to me with cases that I keep. Yeah, so I guess it's a miracle that I just somehow keep having these horrible things happen, that I get a little bit of money. Oh, okay. I did sue City of Fort Collins employee, subcontractor who the city threw under the bus and threw their subcontractor completely out by themselves. I won that lawsuit and I was able to take that settlement and dive into Detective Koopman. So that's how I do it. That's how I do it. And it's not easy, but I'm apparently doing what I'm supposed to do. I love the people, I love justice, and the law is what drives me. But it's mostly the people. The people who come to me and they say, here's my case. It's horrifying. My life is destroyed. I can't take it anymore. It's fine. So yeah, that's how I just somehow keep winning these little tiny lawsuits, and that's how it works. Awkward question. All right. How does the McWhinney Empire figure in with our community's corruption, aside from funding corrupt politicians? And that's a great question, because remember the fire in downtown Fort Collins? So Brinkman Brothers, remember they had conflicting testimony about all of that, all of their financial stability, and then the lost pays on their insurance policy with the City of Fort Collins and the DBA. McWhinney's were actually in the process of purchasing a property next to the building that went up in flames, but then they backed out. They backed out to come down here. So that's an interesting connection. So when downtown development authorities get involved with private developers, there's always there's inherent corruption. You can't avoid it because there's so much money changing hands and there's so much at stake for the city and for the developer. And because of the way they do the financing mechanism for TIFs and all the private districts that go along with it, it's very difficult to track those records. But those are all public records, because anytime there's public money that is used for a private project, you get access to those records. So start getting the records on the McWhinney's. Anytime they have public money, get those records. And I'm going to say that to everything, because that's where the answers are. And a lot of times the contracts are, tedious and it's hard to understand. So it's very difficult to break it down. But that's where the answers are. Get the contracts. Where do we go from here? How do we end this corruption? Well, because there are other agencies that are interested in the Judicial District's corruption, other higher agencies, we can always hope. And we can just keep working hard, we can keep getting records, and keep telling people the truth about what's happening here. I will, like I was saying, I'm going to exploit the information that's in here. We have the names of the supervisors that protected Brian Cooper now, we have the names of the leadership that covered up his crimes, and we have their own words. It's phenomenal what we can do with this. Jensen Hughes report is Fisher Price. It's Sesame Street. And Jensen Hughes can come after me all they want. They didn't ask the right people the right questions. And they got paid a lot of money for it. Now that we have all this information, what do we do? And I know this is like, oh, what do we do with this? What do we do? Well, if you have a case, if you're involved with a case, now you have a different perspective. You know how to approach it better. You know how to help your attorneys. I'm not saying your attorneys are incompetent, but your attorneys need help understanding what actually happened in their case. The record will not show them. So, learn how to do records requests. I have had some requests for teaching that and then how to use it. Learn how to do that. Get the records on everything you question. Everything's a public record. It changes everything. So where do we go from here? More records. And talk. And don't be afraid to talk. And I know Loveland City Council, there's a group of people in Loveland City Council who butcher the community members. You just go up there and tell them what it is. those Loveland City Council members who do that are hoping that you are intimidated to the point where you stop coming. And it happened in Fort Collins. Fort Collins has very few people attending city council meetings anymore because it got very uncomfortable for the people who are paying them to do that work. So here's a question: how did you discover the tracking? How did you discover the tracking device? That's a great question. So for a few months, I kept seeing all these different law enforcement agencies around me. Like, this is weird. Do we have a lot more cops in this area or what? But it was CSU, it was the sheriff's office, it was sometimes Loveland, it was Fort Collins. They were always where I was. I was like, this is weird. And I was actually talking to a reporter at the Colorado and just thought, off the record, and I was like, this is weird. And he said, you're just paranoid. I was like, okay, maybe. But so then I did one particular day, I was at the running track at CSU, and a motorcycle cop followed me onto the track. So he drove his motorcycle onto the jogging track. And I'm like, okay, this is getting really weird. And I thought maybe it was an imposter, because we had an imposter issue in Fort Collins for a while. And so I called Fort Collins police, and I'm like, there's a cop on the track on his motorcycle. And they traced it back to the fact it was actually a CSU motorcycle police officer. And at that point, I'm like, what is going on here? So a couple days later, I did a test to see if I was actually being followed. And I parked my car, in a public area, but then I went for a walk. And I went for a walk and then turned around and came back just to see if there was anybody there. And sure enough, there were 3 Fort Collins police cars around my vehicle. And I'm like, and as soon as they saw me come around the block, they all disappeared. I'm like, okay, this is not my imagination. I'm not paranoid. This really happened. So we actually had law enforcement officers, and some friends suggest that we look under the car, and there it was. It was the most horrifying. You talk about a betrayal of my privacy. I was shocked, and I'm not a real emotional person, but I was jumping up and down, yelling, "Who does this to me? Who did?" I was just really beside myself with a violation and invasion of my privacy. And then because people had suggested Larimer County was not so trustworthy, I actually took the tracking device to Weld County because the sheriff's office there is stellar. They have a really solid foundation and lots of good deputies there. And so I drove it over there, and I'm like, help me out here. And they said that they were shocked to see it because they had only, in the previous 25 years, they had only used one tracking device ever in 25 years prior to that. It had a warrant, and the reason they used it was they were actually tracking a drug cartel from Mexico. And they're like, you must have done something really to piss the sheriff off. Apparently. So, that's how I found it. How can we, as voters, check the background of candidates? And that's a great question. First of all, just go straight to the candidate. They want to talk. Candidates love to talk, so go straight to them. Anything they say to you that doesn't seem right, find a record. Look at all of their website, read all their material, but talk to them. Because I guarantee if you go to John Fayan and say, hey, what about this tracker thing? That'll be an interesting conversation. And by the way, if he gives you any information that conflicts with what I've said here today, please call me and I'll bring you the documents. I'll bring you the record they said didn't exist for 8 years. I'll show you the lawsuit, the federal lawsuit. I'll show you everything that John Fayan has ever said and done. And that reminds me, this is a great question. I ran into John Fayan in the parking lot of 7-Eleven in the middle of summer. And I said, hey, we should probably sit down and talk about this lawsuit. It would serve us both if we talked about this lawsuit. Let's settle this. Let's get it over with. And you know what he said? Now, I can prove it. I can prove what he said. He said, is that thing still active? I didn't even know. I just gave it to my attorney and walked away from it. Wow. That's the attitude John Fayan has for following the law. And human decency? That wasn't very nice. So talk to the candidates directly. Ask them hard questions. Don't ask them the easy questions. Ask them the hard stuff. Ask them, what are your thoughts about Loveland? How does that happen to an agency? Ask them. How can police perjure themselves? Oh, how can police perjure themselves, but if citizens do it, we face jail time? That's another great question. So the police are actually legally allowed to lie to a certain extent, but they're not allowed to lie on official documents. They're not allowed to lie to a judge. They're not allowed to lie in an affidavit, lie to you in an interrogation and try to trip you up. That's just what they do. That's okay. But as soon as they start lying on official documents and records, then that's where the perjury issue happens. Now, in Brian Coogan's case, the public defenders wanted to charge him with perjury, class 4 felony. But the Weld County prosecuting attorneys decided to charge him with a class 4 felony, but it was called attempt to influence a public servant. Instead of charging him with perjury, they went a different route. Turned out to not be a good route. Because it's very hard to convince a jury what it means to try to attempt to influence a judge versus what it means to lie. Any 6-year-old can tell you what the truth is and what a lie is. The jury can do that as well. But when you start tearing the law apart and saying, well, did he really mean to influence this judge or was it an accident? That's when it gets all confusing for the jury. So that was one reason he got away with it. The other reason he got away with his felony charge was the judge in the case did not allow a lot of the evidence about Brian Coogan to be presented. He had no history, it was like he came in there clean and he'd never had a problem before. Have you looked into the gross systemic corruption within all branches of the city of Boulder? That's a great question. I have not specifically looked into the city of Boulder. I have a lot to do in Larimer County, so I'm probably going to focus on my own county for a bit more. Is there a process to obtain NDAs associated with a particular city or court? Yes, so let's just use the city of Loveland. You would file a public records request for, let's say you want a specific NDA on a specific employee. You would file a request for the NDA on, let's say, city manager Steve Adams, just to throw it out there. You want to see if he's ever signed an NDA with the city? Would be interesting. So just pick a name, ask for the NDA, and you'll get your answer. And Chief Luke Hecker, by the way, had signed an NDA, which is weird because he's a public employee, he's a police department employee. He should not have an NDA at all. There should be no non-disclosure agreement for any public employee. But the city of Loveland has used it to their benefit for years. That's it. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your time and your investment, and it's been great to be here with you this afternoon. Safe travels to you all.